The morning I finally understood why my grandfather had asked to have his ashes scattered in the undercroft, the archive had already been igniting for 6 seconds. I didn't notice at first. I was sweeping. That's what I was there to do. Contracted maintenance work, the kind that nobody celebrates and everybody needs. The stone dust that accumulated at the archive's base was pale as chalk and fine as flour, and if you left it long enough, it crept under the lower seal and fouled the humidity sensors that the scholar legates cared so much about. So every morning at 6:30, I came down the service corridor with my broom and my dustpan, and I swept the perimeter of a thing that had refused every learned person on Peleth's End for 300 years, and I didn't think much about it beyond the angle of the broom and the reach of the bristles. The archive itself was 60 feet of pale carved stone, a monolith pillar, though that word undersells it. It was less a pillar than a compressed library, every surface etched with index marks in a script that the scholar legates spent careers failing to fully translate. It stood at the center of the undercroft of Sethis Hall, which was a vaulted subterranean chamber the size of a modest cathedral, lit by shafts of cold daylight that came down through ceiling apertures, cut by whoever had built this place long before the current administrative compact had any claim to it. The walls curved inward overhead. The floor was pale stone, swept clean, by me, mostly. The air tasted of mineral dust and great age. The archive had been sealed since the last registered keeper died, 300 years ago. The record said her name was Sura Vale, and that she had administered the archive's access protocols for 41 years before her death, and that when she died, the archive simply closed, stopped responding. The index marks on its surface went dark. Every scholar legate, Archon, and appointed successor who had pressed a hand to the stone in the 3 centuries since had felt nothing. Smooth carved rock and silence, the same as touching a wall. I knew this the way you know the history of a building you work in, incidentally, without particular feeling. I had been contracted to maintain the undercroft of Sethis Hall for 11 months. In that time, I had watched Scholar Legate Drevith attempt formal activation twice, standing before the archive in full ceremonial sash, with a documented line of institutional succession stretching back to the compact's founding, placing both palms flat against the stone and speaking the registered invocation. Nothing. I had watched Junior Archon Tessic perform a variant ritual, sourced from a recovered administrative text, that had cost the compact 6 years of translation work and considerable money to authenticate. Also nothing. I had swept up after both of them. The chalk-pale stone dust their formal boots had kicked up, the small litter of ceremony that attends failure. I had no ceremony. I had a broom. There had been one other attempt in my 11 months, a visiting Archon from the Tethys delegation, who had traveled 40 days to reach Peleth's End specifically to try. He was an older man, decorated, with a research record that Drevith clearly found intimidating. He spent 2 hours in the undercroft. He tried the formal invocation. He tried a variant from a text his delegation had sourced from a different archive entirely, one that had never been cross-referenced with the Sethis Hall records. He tried, finally, standing at the archive's base in silence for 20 minutes, both hands flat on the stone, as though patience alone could open it. The archive remained what it had always been, smooth carved stone, cool to the touch, indifferent to credentials. He left before I finished sweeping his corridor. I found one of his gloves on the floor near the north face and put it in the lost property box at the top of the service stairs. Nobody claimed it. That morning I worked around the archive's base the way I always did, starting at the north face, moving clockwise, keeping the bristles close to the stone's lower edge where the dust accumulated thickest. The undercroft was empty except for me. Scholar Legate Drevith and her assistant arrived later, at 8th hour, and I preferred to be done before they came down. I worked in the quiet. The ceiling apertures threw long pale columns of early light across the floor, and the dust rose in slow spirals where I swept it toward the pan, and I was thinking about nothing in particular, whether the humidity sensors in Sector 3 needed recalibration, whether the service corridor's lighting strip at the North Junction was finally due for replacement. The first glyph ignited at the base of the archive's south face. I didn't see it immediately. I was facing north. What I noticed was the light changing, a pale, cold luminescence that had no source in the ceiling apertures. I turned, and the glyph was burning, a single carved mark in the archive's lowest register, lit from within with a light that was neither warm nor harsh but simply present, like starlight brought indoors. It was the first time in 300 years, though I didn't know that yet. What I knew was that nothing on that surface was supposed to glow, and it was glowing, and I was the only person in the room. I stood there for a moment. I did not run, I will tell you that, and let you think what you like about it, whether it was courage or simply the slow processing of a man who has spent 11 months in a room with a thing and arrived at a kind of familiarity with it. I had touched the archive's surface myself, once, 3 weeks into the contract, not as ceremony, but by accident, reaching past it to retrieve a dropped dustpan, my hand brushing the lower stone. Nothing had happened, so I had no particular reason to think what was happening now had anything to do with me. The second glyph ignited, then the third. They were climbing. They moved upward from the base in a slow progression, tier by tier, each newly lit mark throwing its cold light into the marks above it, and the archive was coming alive from the bottom up, the way a tree catches fire from the roots. Deliberate, sequential, certain of itself. I watched it. I held the broom. The dust I had raised was still settling in the shafts of morning light. By the time the fourth and fifth marks ignited, I had taken one step back from the archive's face, not from fear, but from an instinct that the appropriate response to what was happening was to give it room. The marks at the base were now bright enough to cast shadows. My shadow, long and thin, stretching behind me toward the north wall. The archive was throwing light I could see by. That had never happened in any record of any activation attempt in 300 years. The most that had ever been documented was a faint warming in the stone that one of Dreveth's instruments had measured, and that she had logged as inconclusive. This was not inconclusive. This was a progression with momentum, and it was building. Scholar Legate Dreveth arrived at the head of the service corridor at 7:15 hour, early, which was unusual, which meant she had been alerted by the environmental sensors. She came through the archway and stopped. Her assistant walked into her back. I remember the sound she made, not a word, just a breath that didn't quite release. She had spent 16 years of her professional life attempting to activate the archive by every legitimate means the compact recognized, and she was standing in the doorway, watching it light up for a maintenance worker holding a broom. I didn't know what to say to her, so I said nothing. The glyphs continued climbing. By the time they reached the archive's mid-register, 30 feet up, the marks there larger and more complex, whole compressed paragraphs of the untranslated script blazing in cold white light. The undercroft had changed from a chamber I knew into something that felt much older than any of us, older than the compact, older than the administrative claim to this world. The light from the marks was filling the space between the curved walls, and the air had a quality I can only describe as a tension, the feeling that something in the room was now oriented. Dreveth walked forward. I don't blame her for it. She had earned the right by every institutional measure that existed. She crossed the floor and placed her palms against the stone beside me. Nothing changed in the archive sequence. The glyphs did not slow or accelerate for her. They continued their climb without acknowledgement, as though she were not there. She stepped back. I saw her face when she did, and I will not describe it in detail, because it is not my place, but I will say that she had understood something, and that it had cost her. The uppermost register of glyphs ignited. The archive was fully lit from base to apex, 60 feet of cold blazing script in the pale morning light of the undercroft, and the stone at its center, which had always been flat and sealed, began to separate. Not violently, not with any drama, the way a door opens when the person who holds the key finally arrives home. A seam appeared in the archive's face, vertical, running its full height, and the two halves drew back into themselves, and what was inside was not a hollow. It was a core of pale, compressed light, organized, structured, alive in the way that very old things are alive, which is to say patiently and with full attention. The light resolved into a voice, or the voice resolved from the light. I am not sure of the sequence. What I know is that it spoke once, in a register that sat between sound and something felt in the chest, in a language I should not have understood and did, the way you understand a word you have never been taught but somehow always knew. You were always the custodian. It was not a greeting. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of administrative record. The archive was logging what had always been true, and the act of logging it was also the act of ending 300 years of an open question. I stood in the undercroft with my broom and heard my own function read back to me, and what I felt was not power or revelation or the kind of joy that I think the scholar legates had imagined would attend this moment. What I felt was the specific weight of understanding something that had been true your whole life without your knowledge. My grandfather had asked to have his ashes scattered here. His father before him had worked these halls. His father's mother had come to Pelith's End as part of a labor compact she did not fully understand, drawn by something she described in the one letter of hers that survived as a feeling that the work was here, that the place needed tending, that she could not explain why she knew that, but she did. 300 years of my family drifting toward this dead administrative world because something in us responded to a call we had never consciously heard. The archive had not been waiting for a scholar. It had been waiting for the bloodline of the people who had been built to maintain it. Built, I think, in the long sense, over generations, by predecessors who understood that the keeper of a thing and the cataloger of a thing are not the same office. Suravael had been the last of us who knew what she was. When she died, the archive sealed itself and waited for the line to find its way back. We just hadn't known we were looking. Drevith said something behind me. I think she asked if I was all right. I told her I was. I asked her if she had a pen and something to write on, because I had a feeling there were protocols to update, and I did not know how long the archive would stay open, or what it would need next. But I knew that whatever came next, I was not going to leave it standing in the dust. Some things simply need someone to show up and do the work. Apparently some things wait 300 years for the right person to do it. I have my grandfather's broom. I kept it when he died. I did not know why I kept it until the morning the archive spoke, and now I know it the way I know my own name, without question, without need of further explanation, settled and certain and mine. The undercroft of Sethis Hall is fully operational for the first time in 3 centuries. I am its custodian. The compact has filed the appropriate paperwork. Scholar Legate Drevith has been gracious about it, more gracious than I would have been in her position, and I am grateful for that. Every morning at 6:30, I still come down the service corridor. I still sweep the base. Old habits are hard to stop, and besides, the dust still accumulates, and someone has to do it, and I am the someone. The archive glows when I arrive, not dramatically, just a low luminescence in the lowest tier of marks, the kind of glow a lit room gives off under a door, an acknowledgement, a confirmation that the right person has come through. 300 years is a long time to hold a door closed. I figure the least I can do is keep the floor clean.